There is a moment, most people never talk about it, when a person who has spent years guarding royalty stops seeing them as symbols and starts seeing them as human beings. It happens quietly, not in a grand ballroom or at a state funeral. It happens in a hallway at 2 a.m. It happens over a cup of tea nobody asked for. It happens in a half second when someone powerful thinks nobody is watching and lets their face do something real. James Whitfield had been a royal protection officer for 11 years. He had stood outside doors, walked 3 steps behind motorcades, memorized exit routes, and learned to make himself invisible. He was good at invisible. He had perfected it the way some men perfect silence. Not from shyness, but from discipline. You do not exist. You are a post, a shadow with a radio. He had served under 3 different royal assignments before he was transferred to the household of the Princess of Wales. Not Diana, Kate. This is where people get confused. And it is important before the story goes anywhere to say plainly, James never met Diana. Diana died in a tunnel in Paris in 1997. James was 17 years old when it happened. He was sitting in his mother's kitchen in Derbyshire eating cornflakes when the news came on. He remembers the cornflakes going soggy. He remembers his mother putting her hand over her mouth. He remembers thinking, in the way 17-year-olds think, that something enormous had just changed, though he could not say what. He could not have known, sitting there with soggy cornflakes, that 26 years later he would be standing in a corridor outside a door, and that through that door, a woman would be doing something so quietly human, so unexpectedly familiar, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain it to people who were not there. And that every time he tried, someone would say, "She reminded you of Diana, didn't she?" And every time he would pause, because the answer was not simple. Because comparison is a lazy thing, and what he saw in that corridor was not a copy of something lost. It was something that had grown from the same soil, something that had taken root in its own way, in its own season. This is the story of a guard, a door, and a glimpse of something that does not have a clean name. Some things you see on duty change the way you do the job. This changed the way he understood it. James Whitfield did not choose royal protection. It chose him the way most things chose men like him, through a chain of small, undramatic decisions that added up to a life. He had joined the Metropolitan Police at 22. He had been good at his job in the way that quiet, observant people are good at jobs that require them to notice things other people miss. A supervisor noticed him noticing things. A recommendation was made. A form was filled out. 3 years of standard protection work followed, 2 overseas assignments, 1 promotion, and then, in the spring of 2019, a transfer to the household protection detail of William and Catherine, Prince and Princess of Wales. He was told, in the brief and practical way these things were told, that the role was demanding, that discretion was the only currency that mattered, and that anything he witnessed in the course of his duties was not his to keep, share, or carry out of those rooms. He understood. He had understood before the sentence finished. What nobody told him, because nobody could tell you this, you had to learn it yourself through the particular education of proximity, was how strange it was to be close to someone famous. Not famous in the way a footballer is famous or a pop singer, where the fame is made of performances and posters and things that were designed to be seen. Royal famous was different. It was old. It had weight. It was built from centuries of ritual and image management so thorough that even the people inside it sometimes seemed uncertain where the ritual ended and the person began. James had his first assignment with the Princess of Wales in April of that year, a visit to a children's hospital in Birmingham. He rode in the convoy. He walked 3 steps behind. He watched exits. He watched faces in the crowd. He did not watch her. Not really. Not in the way you watch a person. He watched the space around her, which is what protection means. What he noticed in the professional, cataloging way he noticed everything was that she was efficient with people. Not cold, nothing like cold, but efficient. She moved through the ward with a kind of practiced warmth, bending down to children's level, asking names, making eye contact. She touched hands carefully. She laughed at the right moments. It was from the outside, a skilled performance of genuine feeling, and James could not tell where one ended and the other began. He suspected she could not always tell either. He did not think about Diana that day. He was not the sort of man who thought about Diana. Diana had been a figure of his childhood, more myth than memory, the way historical events always were when you had been too young to understand them. He knew the rough shape of the story, the people's princess, the marriage, the divorce, the paparazzi, the tunnel. He knew the rough shape, the way you know a country you have never visited. Borders and capitals, but not the texture of the streets. His mother had cried when Diana died. He remembered that clearly. His mother was not a woman who cried easily. She was a retired schoolteacher from Derbyshire who had opinions about everything and expressed them bluntly. She had not cried at James's father's funeral. She had organized it with the focus of a field general and cried 3 weeks later alone in the garden. James had found her there and brought her inside, and neither of them had spoken about it directly. That was how their family handled large feelings. You built a container for them and put the lid on and carried the container. His mother had cried at the news of Diana, and James had eaten his cornflakes and watched her and thought, this woman matters to people in a way I do not understand yet. He was 39 years old now. He still did not entirely understand it, but he was closer. The first 6 months on the detail were unremarkable in the way professional experiences are when you're learning the rhythms of a new environment. He learned the schedules. He learned the staff who was quick and who was slow, who made good decisions under pressure and who folded. He learned the architecture of the various residences, the back corridors, the service stairs, the rooms that were used daily, and the rooms that felt like museum pieces, kept perfect and untouched, existing only to be photographed at Christmas. He learned, in the slow way you learn the habits of people you observe without speaking, to something about the woman at the center of it all. She was disciplined. That was the first and most persistent impression. Not in a rigid way. She was not brittle about it, did not snap when things went sideways. But she had a structure to her days that she maintained with quiet insistence. She ran in the mornings before the children were up. She read in the evenings after they were down. She was meticulous about her correspondence in a way that seemed slightly old-fashioned, handwritten notes where most people would have sent an email, thank you cards that went out within 48 hours. She had a way of remembering small things, names, birthdays, a detail someone had mentioned once in passing, that James recognized from his own training. He used it professionally. She seemed to use it personally. That was the difference. What he did not see for a long time was the private version of her. This was not unusual. You rarely did. Not in the first year, not until the rhythm of the detail made you invisible enough that people forgot to perform for you. It was a strange kind of trust, not personal trust, not friendship, but the trust of habit. You became furniture. You became weather. People stopped adjusting themselves because you were there. It happened gradually through the autumn and into the winter of that year. Small things. She started saying good morning without looking up when he took a position in the morning. Not the public good morning. Not the performed warmth of the hospital visit. Just a distracted, half-awake acknowledgement that he existed. He found that more meaningful than it had any right to be. He noted it the way he noted exits. Categorized it. Filed it away. There was a day in November, gray and wet, when a school visit ran 40 minutes over and the convoy was delayed, and they sat in the vehicle longer than anyone wanted. He was not in the vehicle with her. His position was the follow car, but he saw her through the window when they finally reached the residence. She got out of the car and stood in the rain for a moment, not moving, just standing there with her eyes closed and her face tilted up slightly, and the rain came down on her, and she stayed like that for maybe 4 seconds. 5. Then she opened her eyes, straightened, and walked inside. He thought about that. He was still thinking about it a week later. It was such a small thing, such a private thing. The kind of thing you do when you forget where the edges of yourself end and the world begins. She had stood in the rain for 5 seconds and let it land on her, and in those 5 seconds she had been nobody's princess. Nobody's anything. just a person standing in the weather. He did not tell anyone. He would not have known how to explain why it stayed with him. You cannot write in a report that the person you were protecting stood in the rain, and it made you understand something you cannot name. Winter deepened. The detail continued. He was reassigned once briefly for a foreign trip, and then returned to the household. He settled back into the furniture of it, the weather of it. He observed. He filed things away. He carried them in the container with the lid on. It was in the early weeks of 2020, just before everything changed, just before the world went sideways and locked itself away, that the thing happened in the corridor. The thing he would spend years trying to explain. He had been on an overnight post. Not unusual, one of the quiet duties, the kind where nothing happens and you spend the hours listening to your own breathing and the sounds of the building settling. The residence was old. Old buildings have their own voices at night. He had learned them. He knew which creak was which door, which draft was which window. He knew the sounds that meant something and the sounds that meant nothing. He heard footsteps at 2 in the morning. Soft, unhurried. He was positioned at the end of a corridor, and the footsteps came from the direction of the private quarters. Not the children. He knew the sound of small feet, chaotic and unpatterned. These were adult footsteps, deliberate but not urgent. She appeared at the far end of the corridor. She did not see him immediately. The corridor was long, and the lighting was low, and his position was in shadow, which was where his position was supposed to be. She was in a dressing gown, her hair down, no jewelry, no makeup. In her hands, she carried a small stack of papers, printed photographs by the look of them, and she was looking down at them as she walked, very slowly, the way you move when you're not really going anywhere, when the walking is just a way to think. She stopped about halfway down the corridor, beneath the one lamp that was still lit. She stood there in the circle of that light, and looked at the photographs, and her face did something. He saw clearly. He was trained to see clearly. She smiled, but not the public smile, not the practiced warmth of the hospital visit. This was the smile of someone looking at something that hurt them and brought them joy at the same time. The kind of smile that only happens when no one is watching. The kind that lives in the face for half a second and then is gone because even alone, people protect themselves from the size of some feelings. He did not move. He was furniture. He was weather. He did not exist. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the photographs, and then she pressed one of them lightly against her chest, just held it there, flat against her sternum, eyes down, and stood very still. The way you stand when you're holding something in place, when you're using the weight of your own body to keep something from flying apart. Then she straightened, tucked the photographs under her arm, and walked back the way she had come. He stood in the shadow of his position and breathed carefully for a long time after she was gone. He did not know what the photographs were of. He did not allow himself to speculate. That was not his business. But he had seen what he had seen. And what he had seen was a woman standing alone in a corridor in the middle of the night, holding something against her chest like it was the most important thing in any room. He had seen people do that before. Mothers, mostly. Occasionally fathers. People who had something they loved so much or had lost so completely that the ordinary containers, words, gestures, public expressions, were not large enough to hold it, and so it overflowed at 2 in the morning in quiet corridors when everyone else was asleep. He drove home in the gray early morning when his shift ended, and he sat at his kitchen table and drank a coffee that went cold before he finished it. He thought about the photograph pressed against her chest. He thought about the smile that hurt. He did not think about Diana. He thought about his mother in the garden. He thought about the lid on the container. He thought, and this surprised him because he was not a sentimental man, that there are some things a person carries quietly that never get lighter, only more familiar, and that the measure of a person is not whether they put the weight down. The measure is what they do with it still on their back. He finished the cold coffee. He got up. He washed the mug. He went to bed. He slept better than he had expected. The world shut down in March 2020, and the detail changed the way everything changed suddenly and completely, and in ways nobody had prepared for because nobody could have. James adapted. That was what he did. Adaptation was not a mood or a philosophy for him. It was a mechanical skill, the same as any other. You assessed the new terrain. You found the exits. You adjusted your position. The pandemic changed the texture of royal protection in ways that were difficult to articulate without sounding strange. The public-facing part of the work vanished almost entirely. No hospital visits, no school visits, no convoys through cheering crowds. What remained was something quieter and, in some ways, more intimate. The bubble. The reduced household. The smaller world within the smaller world. He was among the core detail that stayed on through the first lockdown. This meant weeks, eventually months, of operating within a residential environment that was, compared to the public schedule, profoundly ordinary. Children doing schoolwork at kitchen tables. Adults negotiating the particular strain of confined domestic life. The machinery of a famous household running on reduced power, the public face stored away like furniture under dust sheets. And in that reduced, quieter world, the thing James had been filing away in his careful mental cabinet, the observations, the small moments, the rain on the face, and the footsteps in the corridor began to accumulate differently, because now there were more of them. And they were harder to dismiss. He saw her read to the children on the floor, not seated in a chair reading down to them. On the floor, cross-legged, one child tucked under each arm, the book held out in front like an offering. She did the voices. Different voices for different characters, some of them quite bad, in the way voices are bad when you don't care about being good and only care about the child laughing. The children laughed. She laughed at them laughing. He stood at his post and watched and thought, this is not for anyone. There is no camera. There is no event. He saw her on a video call late one afternoon. He was not meant to observe it. He had come around a corner quietly in the way he always moved, and the door was open, and she was talking to someone, a woman. He could not see who, and she was crying. Not the dramatic kind. The slow, tired kind. The kind that happens when your face runs out of energy to hold itself up. She was nodding while she cried, saying yes, 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 in the way you agree with things that are hard to hear. He backed away from the doorway without making a sound. He went to the end of the corridor and stood very still and looked at the wall for a moment. He saw her lose her temper exactly once. It was over something administrative, a scheduling conflict, a miscommunication between members of staff that had rippled into a public commitment and could not be easily undone. She raised her voice, not screaming, not abusive, but raised the words crisp and pointed in the way that well-bred, disciplined people raise their voice when they finally raise it, each word placed like something sharp. And then she stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the desk. She breathed through her nose for 3 counts. She looked up at the member of staff who had delivered the bad news and said, more quietly, let's find the solution rather than the problem. And moved on. He thought about that phrase. He wrote it down that evening in the small notebook he kept, not officially, not as a report, just for himself. The habit of a careful mind. Let's find the solution rather than the problem. He had heard variations of it before in management courses, in briefings. But there was a difference between saying a phrase like that because it was the correct professional thing to say and saying it because you had just climbed down from genuine anger and chosen a direction. She had chosen a direction. He had watched her choose it in real time. It was in the 5th week of lockdown that a member of the household staff tested positive. The subsequent logistics were complicated, and for a period of several days, several members of the core team were required to operate in reduced capacity while protocols were established. James found himself, during this period, covering a broader footprint than usual. More corridors, more rooms, more hours. On one of those evenings, a Tuesday, he is precise about this because he has told the story enough times in his head that the details have calcified. He was covering a wing of the residence that he did not usually patrol at that hour. He had walked the route twice, confirmed all positions, and was making his way back along a corridor when he heard music. Not loud. A recording, low volume, coming from behind a partially open door. He knew the room, a small sitting room off the main corridor, used occasionally as an informal office. He did not slow. He did not approach. He continued walking his line. But the music reached him as he passed the open door. He registered it in the way he registered everything, noting it, filing it, classifying it as relevant or not. It was a piece he did not immediately recognize. Classical. Strings. Something old and very deliberate. He took 3 more steps past the door. Then he stopped. He stood in the corridor for a moment. The music continued. Quiet strings in a dark hallway at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday in a world that had stopped moving. He knew the music. He had not known it for the first 3 seconds, but by the 4th second it had reached some shelf in his memory and knocked something loose. His mother had played it. Not often. Only in the evenings, rarely, when the house was quiet and she thought no one was listening. He had asked her once what it was. She had told him the name. He could not remember the name now. And then said, very simply, is a piece about carrying on. He had been perhaps 12 years old. He had not understood what she meant. He understood now. He walked the corridor back to his position. He stood at his post. The music continued faintly for another 20 minutes and then stopped. He heard nothing else from the room. He did not speculate about why she was listening to it. He did not allow himself to build a story around it. But later, much later, he would describe this moment as the one where something shifted in the way he thought about her. Not as a subject, not as a principle to be protected, but as a person doing the same complicated and unfinished thing that everyone around her was also doing. The same thing his mother had done. The same thing he did in his own quiet, contained way. Carrying something. Finding music that made the carrying feel slightly less alone. It was around this time that people began, in the way the public always begins when there is a crisis, to compare. He saw it on his phone in the evenings. The articles, the commentary, the social media arguments that ran in endless circles. Diana would have handled this differently. Diana never hid. Diana would have been out in the streets. And then the counter-arguments, equally loud, equally certain. She is not Diana. She is not supposed to be Diana. Diana was not even who we thought Diana was. He read these things the way he read a lot of things, with the professional detachment of a man who has learned that most public commentary about people is about the commentator's needs, not the subject's reality. People needed Diana. They still needed her. They needed her in the way people need things they lost before they were finished with them, before they had extracted everything they required. Diana had been taken incomplete. The need had never resolved. And so it lived on, and it attached itself to things that rhymed with her. The compassion, the warmth, the willingness to be vulnerable in public, the connection with ordinary people that bypassed formality and went straight to the human thing underneath. He thought about this carefully. He was not equipped to write a thesis on it. He was a protection officer from Derbyshire who read more than most people assumed and felt things more than he expressed. But he had been watching this woman closely for the better part of a year, in conditions more revealing than any public event could be, and he had a thought that he could not quite set aside. Diana had been described, endlessly and by everyone, as someone who made people feel seen. Not looked at. Seen. There was a difference. Looking at someone was about the looker. Seeing them was about making them real to yourself in a way that cost something. Diana had apparently had a talent for it so acute that it had seemed, to people on the receiving end, almost supernatural. Like she had looked through them and touched something true. He had not met Diana. He could not make that comparison. But he thought about the children's hospital in Birmingham. He thought about the faces in that ward. The sick children, the exhausted parents. He thought about the woman moving through that ward. He thought about the practiced warmth and the question of where it became unpracticed. He thought about the floor reading and the voices for different characters and the way she had laughed at the children laughing. Seeing people, letting it cost something. He thought it was possible, not certain, not something he would say out loud in a report or even in a pub, that this was not something you inherited or learned. It was something you chose to keep. Repeatedly, against the easier options, against the pull of distance and self-protection that fame and pressure and loss generate in people. You chose to stay open to the specific gravity of other human beings, even when being open was expensive. Diana had chosen it, had paid for it in ways that were still being debated. And here was this other woman, in a different century, in a different kind of spotlight, making choices in quiet rooms and night corridors and rainy driveways that suggested she was making the same fundamental decision. Not because of Diana, not an imitation of Diana, but because some choices are not about inheritance. They're about character. And character, in James Whitfield's considered and professionally informed experience, was the most persistent thing a person owned. His mother called him one evening during that 5th week. She was in Derbyshire, alone in the house, managing the lockdown with the same organized competence with which she managed everything. She asked about his work in the careful, non-specific way she always asked, knowing he could not share details and respecting that boundary because she had raised him to respect it. He told her he was fine. She told him she had been listening to music in the evenings. He asked her what kind. She said the old kind, the carry-on kind. He did not tell her what he had heard through a half-open door. He could not, but he sat with the phone to his ear in his kitchen and felt for the first time in a long while that the world was slightly smaller and slightly more connected than the distance between its various enclosures suggested. That people in grand residences and people in small Derbyshire houses were listening to the same old music in the evenings for the same unreported reasons. That the carrying went on regardless of where you were doing it. He hung up the phone. He sat in his kitchen. He thought about a woman pressing a photograph against her chest in a night corridor. He thought about his mother in the garden in the rain. He thought about Diana, whom he had never met, who had died when he was 17 and eating cornflakes, and about whom he still could not say exactly what he understood, only that the not understanding was getting slowly more specific, which was perhaps the same thing. The music came back to him, that deliberate, old music, strings in a quiet house. It is a piece about carrying on, his mother had said. He thought she had been right about that. He thought a lot of people were carrying a lot on, and that you could not always see the weight from the outside, and that this was not a failure of visibility, but a feature of dignity. The weight was private. The carrying was the public thing. And the carrying done with grace over time in the face of everything that pushed against it, that was what people responded to. Not because it was royal, not because it was famous, because it was human. And humans, in James Whitfield's experience, recognized each other across very large distances when one of them was doing something true. James Whitfield left the Royal Protection Detail in the autumn of 2022. He did not leave under difficult circumstances. There was no incident, no disagreement, no internal friction. He left the way competent, steady people sometimes leave things because something else called, because a decade of a certain kind of invisible work has a weight that accumulates slowly, and then one morning you feel the full amount of it and know it's time to set it down. He was 42 years old. His mother was getting older in Derbyshire. He had decided to move closer. He had put in his papers. He had shaken hands and meant it. He moved to a town 20 minutes from his mother's house. He took a private security consulting role that paid well and asked less of him in the particular way his previous work had asked. He drove his mother to her appointments. He had her for Sunday dinners. He learned, in the easy and unhurried way of adult children who arrive late to the business of being present, what kind of person she had always been when he had not been standing close enough to see. She was, it turned out, very funny. He had known she was competent and strong and occasionally difficult. He had not known, not really, how funny she was. Her timing was impeccable in the dry, northern way. She would say something so perfectly placed that he would be 3 seconds into his next sentence before he registered it, and then laugh alone, late, which she found deeply satisfying. She stored it up. She waited for the moment. She never oversold it. He thought about timing a lot that year, about what it meant to wait for the right moment, to trust the silence before the thing, to let the shape of a space do work that words would ruin. He had started talking. He had not expected to. He was not, by nature or habit, a man who processed things aloud. But The move, the change in pace, the evenings with his mother, something loosened. He found himself, over dinners and during drives, beginning sentences he had not planned. He told her about the pandemic detail. He told her about the Birmingham hospital visit. He told her about the rain on the driveway. He did not tell her about the night corridor. Some things stay private not because they're secrets, but because they belong to a kind of silence that speech would diminish. But he told her enough. He told her more than he had told anyone. His mother listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, without making sounds of affirmation, without performing her own engagement. She just listened, let arrive. Then she said when he was finished that it sounded like he had been watching someone learn to live inside their own size. He did not know what she meant immediately. He turned it over. He drove home and turned it over. He woke the next morning and it had arrived somewhere useful. To live inside your own size. He thought about that for a long time. What it meant. The size of a life that was watched from the outside, that was measured against predecessors and weighted with expectations, that carried the shape of someone else's story inside it like a watermark you could only see when you held it to the light. Diana had been a size that her own life could barely contain. She had exceeded it constantly, overflowed, pressed against every edge. This had made her impossible to ignore and had, in the end, contributed to the manner of her death, chased by the size of what she had become to other people, outrunning what they needed her to be, until she could not run fast enough. He thought about the woman he had watched for 2.5 years. He thought about the discipline, the structure, the carefully maintained rhythms of a life. The decision, visible to anyone watching closely enough, to take the same essential quality, the openness to people, the willingness to feel things in public and mean them, and house it inside a container that was stronger, more deliberate, more resistant to being cracked open by outside pressure. He thought she had watched what happened when you gave everything away without a structure to sustain the giving. He thought she had built the structure first, not from coldness, not from calculation, from something that looked to him very much like the knowledge of what the alternative cost. His mother had once said to him, a long time ago, that the bravest thing a person can do is not to throw themselves at something with no concern for the consequences. The bravest thing is to move towards something frightening while caring very much about the consequences and moving anyway. The first kind of bravery is easy. Easy in the way that breaking things is easy. The second kind costs. He had thought, at the time, that she was talking about his father, about the slow years of his father's illness, and what it had required of her to stay present through all of it, to keep caring when caring became the harder option every single day. He thought she had probably been talking about that, but he also thought now that she had been talking about something broader, something she had seen in people over a long life of watching people carefully that she wanted to name so that he would have the name when he needed it. He needed it now. He was grateful she had given it to him. In the spring of 2023, the news came about the king's cancer diagnosis. Then, later, in the early months of 2024, the news about the Princess of Wales. Her surgery, her disappearance from public view. The theories, the speculation, the social media eruption of opinion that swelled and distorted and fed on itself in the way such things always did. And then her own announcement, her own words, her own decision to tell the truth before anyone else could construct a version of it. James watched this from his small town in Derbyshire. He watched it the way civilians watch things, on a phone, on a television, from a great distance. He was no longer furniture in those rooms. He was just a man who had once been close to the story and was now watching it from outside like everyone else. He watched the announcement video. He watched it more than once. He watched the way she sat, the way she held herself, the particular composure of someone who has decided absolutely and finally that the truth is less frightening than the management of what people imagine the truth to be. He watched her face do the thing her face did, the thing he had studied for 2.5 years in professional proximity, and he saw in it very clearly the same quality he had seen in a corridor at 2 in the morning. The willingness to carry things in public that most people carry only in private. to say, this is happening to me. It is real. I am a person it is happening to, and I'm choosing to tell you not because I owe you an explanation, but because the alternative, the silence, the management, the protection of an image at the cost of truth, is a price I am no longer willing to pay. Diana had paid it. For years she had paid it. And then one day she had decided she would not pay it anymore. And she had walked into the BBC studios and told a man in a rumpled suit the truth about her marriage and her life and what it had done to her. And the world had held its breath and then exhaled with the particular relief of a thing finally named. Diana's truth had been explosive, unstoppable. It had blown through the official version like it was made of paper. This truth was different, quieter, more considered, delivered not in rebellion, but in acceptance. Here is what is real. Here is what is happening. I'm telling you because I am a person and this is what happened to me, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. He thought, sitting in his house in Derbyshire, watching the same video the rest of the world was watching, that this was perhaps the most important thing. Not the comparison between the two women, which was lazy and, in some ways, unkind to both of them, because comparisons flatten what is specific and reel into what is convenient and portable. Not the question of who was more human or more brave or more honest, but the thing underneath both of those lives, the thing that ran through them like a current, the commitment to the truth of one's own experience, even when the machinery of image management, of public life, of royal protocol, of simple self-protection pushed against it with enormous force. To be real in a context that requires unreality. To be specific in a role that demands the general. To be a person when the institution wants a symbol. Diana had done this. Had done it with a force that broke things. Kate was doing it with a precision that was building things. Both were necessary. Both were, in their ways, the same fundamental act of insisting on personhood against a current that moved steadily in the other direction. He put his phone down. He walked into his mother's house. It was a Sunday. She had made a roast, the good kind, the kind she only made when she felt like the day deserved it. He sat down, and she put a plate in front of him, and they talked about nothing in particular, the garden, a neighbor, a television program she had been watching. And then she said, without preamble, without looking up from her own plate, "She's all right, that one." He knew who she meant. His mother had been watching the same news. He said, "Yes, she is." His mother said, "She reminds me of someone." And he said, "I know." And his mother looked up at him then, and he looked at her, and neither of them said the name because the name was too large for the kitchen table, and they both knew it. And there's some things that communicate themselves more completely in the space where the word should be than in the word itself. They ate the roast. The afternoon came in through the window, the flat northern light that James had grown up with and returned to and found in middle age, not bleak as he had once thought it, but honest. Honest light. Light that did not dress things up. Light that showed what was there. He thought about a woman pressing a photograph against her chest in a night corridor. He thought about his mother in the garden after his father's funeral. He thought about carrying on, about the old music, about the things you hold against yourself in private, so they do not fly apart. He thought about the quality that certain people have, and it is not inherited, and it is not taught, and it is not manufactured by public relations teams or media training sessions. The quality of being genuinely, specifically, costly present to other human beings. The willingness to let what happens to people actually happen to you. To not use the glass wall. To stay on the soft side of things, even when the soft side hurts. Diana had that quality. It had defined her and eventually consumed her. Kate had it too. Had it differently. Had built around it carefully without extinguishing it. The way you build around a fire when you want it to last through a long night rather than burn bright and short. James Whitfield was not a romantic. He was a protection officer from Derbyshire who had spent 20 years standing in corridors so that other people could move through the world safely. He had seen things in those corridors that had changed the way he understood what safety meant. Safety was not just the absence of threat. Safety was the presence of something worth protecting. And what was worth protecting, in his experience, the thing that most needed guarding, the thing most vulnerable to the forces that pressed against it, was not the image, not the title, not the carefully maintained public face. It was the person inside, the specific private, late-night, rain-standing, music listening, photograph pressing, children reading, real and unrepeatable person underneath all of it. He had spent 2.5 years protecting the outside. He thought now that the more important work, and it was work nobody hired you to do, work you chose or did not choose, was protecting the inside. Keeping intact, keeping it human, keeping it capable of the kind of presence that made sick children in Birmingham feel seen, that made exhausted parents feel less alone, that made a man watching a video on a phone in a small house in Derbyshire feel, for reasons he could not entirely explain, that things were going to be all right. Diana had left too soon. Kate was still here. And whatever it was that ran through both of them, that particular quality, that insistence on the human thing, it was still here too. Still moving. Still finding its way through rooms and corridors and hospitals and cameras and all the machinery of modern royal life. Still somehow intact. He finished his roast. He thanked his mother for the cooking. He washed up while she sat with her tea in the other room. He could hear the television, a low murmur, the news moving on to other things the way it always moved on, because the news does not stop for any one story, no matter how large it is. He dried his hands. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden. The light was going. The honest northern light, doing what it always did, quietly, without announcement, without drama. Carrying on.